Hello, grade 11s. We are now moving on to lesson 4 in the series of lessons on rivers. Let's begin. A geomorphologist by the name of Davies proposed a theory, and in his theory he tells us about the fact that a river passes through different stages in its development. If we look at this slide over here, we will see exactly what he is referring to. Now, firstly, do you notice that that is a diagram showing the long profile of the river? Do you remember what the long profile is? You would be right if you said that the long profile is the side view of the whole pathway of that river. Now, Davies tells us that if one looks at the whole pathway or the whole length of the river, you can actually divide that river into 3 different stages. So the first stage is referred to as the upper course. The upper course can also be known as the youthful course. Now this makes absolute sense. A youthful river is a river that is found upstream near the source where it has just begun. It is in its upper stage of development because this is up in the mountains. Now as we go along the path of the river, we then see that it moves into its second stage of development. This stage we referred to as the middle course of the fluvial cycle. This can also be referred to as the mature stage. In this stage, the river is downstream of the source. In other words, the river has now moved away from the mountains and it is in its middle stage. It's halfway along the path of the river. As we continue along the path of the river, we then see that the river enters its lower course. The lower course can also be referred to as the old stage of the fluvial cycle. Once again, this makes logical sense as this is the part of the river that is near the mouth. It is the final stage just before the river flows into the ocean and stops. So in a way, one could almost liken the fluvial cycle of a river to that of the life cycle of a living being. It is born, and when it is born and it begins, it is young, it then matures and gets older until eventually it ends. So it's certainly very much like any living being. We are going to see how as the river develops from one course to the next, you will notice that not only does the river look different in each of its stages of development, but it also behaves differently. Let's see how this works. We're going to begin at the beginning with the youthful stage. We're going to gain an understanding now of the characteristics of a river in its upper stage of development. Look carefully at the photographs because, as they say, a photo says 1,000 words. As the river in its youthful stage is found up in the mountains, near its source, one would fully expect the river to be small. A youthful river is actually made up of many small, short tributaries. Do you see where those red arrows are pointing? They're pointing towards very small and very short streams that are flowing in the mountain regions. As these young rivers are flowing down the side of a mountain, the gradient of a young river is very steep. So gravity plays its role in allowing the water in those young streams to flow energetically down the side of the mountain. Being up in the mountain, and have a look at that photograph, do you see all those rocks? So a young river carries along a bed load, or if you remember, traction, this being large boulders and rocks. It also carries along saltation. Do you remember what the saltation was? Remember, saltation are the small pebbles that bounce along the bottom of the riverbed. So there we see our young river flowing energetically. There's a turbulent flow. That river is bubbly. It's energetic. Of course, looking even closer at the photograph, we can observe that the river is very narrow and very shallow, and the water is clear. I don't know if anybody has ever drunk water out of a little stream up in the mountains, and I think the first thing that does strike one is how lovely tasting and fresh the water is, and just how crystal clear it really is. There is no sand, it is just clear water. Now, something very important happens in the youthful stage of the river. As this river is energetically flowing down that steep side of the mountain, it is able to roll the rocks along the bottom of the riverbed. The traction load rolls along the bottom of the riverbed. This causes downward vertical erosion, where those big rocks cut into the bottom of the riverbed. This creates a very narrow, steep, deep valley that has a V shape. If you have a look at, and I actually want to try and show you this, if you have a look at this diagram, do you actually see what I'm saying when I say it is a V-shaped valley? That valley is so narrow that it really does create a V shape. I hope that you can actually see that where I've highlighted it. Also have a look at the photograph and notice how that young river completely occupies the bottom of the river valley. If you would actually have wanted to go down to that river and lay out a nice picnic blanket and sort of sit next to that river as it rolls and flows down the side of the mountain, you actually wouldn't have any space, because on either side of that very narrow river, you have the steep sides of the mountain going up. This diagram shows us the cross profile of the youthful valley. Now, do you remember that term, cross profile? Remember, the cross profile of the river shows us what the width of the river looks like. And there, in that diagram, we once again observe that in the youthful stage of the river, the valley is narrow, it's steep, and it is V-shaped. Once again, let me emphasize that. And there we can see the V of the river. I'm really not very good at this, am I? But anyway, I hope I've highlighted the fact that the young river is a V-shaped valley. So we're carrying on down the path or down the length of the river, and we now are moving into the mature valley. We are now looking at a river in its middle stage of development. This means that the river has left the mountains and it is now flowing along a flatter gradient. Grade 11, listen to my words. I'm not saying it's flowing along a flat gradient. I am saying it is flowing along a flatter gradient than it previously was. Because the river is flowing along a slightly flatter gradient, the river starts to meander. Have a look at that photograph. When I say the river is meandering, I am saying to you that it is winding from side to side. So when we say that a river has a meandering canal, we are saying that it creates loop-like bends across the landscape. Please have a look at my photograph. I've just seen now that I have a really bad typo error. It should not be loop-like bends. It should be loop-like bends because the river loops from one side to the next. So that's important to remember. A mature river meanders. Now, have a look at that photograph. I don't know if you can see that that color of that river water is much browner. It's more muddy. And the reason for this is that the river lode in the middle stage is made essentially up of the suspension. And if you remember, the suspension lode are the smaller particles like sand that the river carries along. Now, do you remember, I've just said to you, when the river is in its youthful stage, its load is the saltation, the pebbles, and the traction, the rocks. And that is why a young river has a clear colour to its water. However, by the time that this mature river has left the mountain, those rocks and those stones have been eroded down into mud, therefore giving the mature river a brown, muddy colour. Now, as this river is meandering and looping and winding from side to side, so it begins to erode the sides of the valley. In other words, as it's winding over, it'll erode here and it'll erode over here on the side. So in the mature stage of the fluvial cycle, the river erodes laterally. There is lateral erosion. Now, because the river is wearing away the sides of the valley, this makes the valley wider, and this creates a U-shaped valley. Okay, I'm going to try again with my highlighting, not my strongest point. There we go. Have a look at that. Can you pick up, okay, how that has created your U-shaped valley? The valley is much wider than what it was when it was a younger river in the mountains. Now, when the river is in its mature stage, all the tributaries have got much longer, and all these long tributaries join up to the main river. This means that your mature river gains more water. In other words, its volume of water increases. And because it's carrying more water, the river canal becomes much wider and much deeper. So it has a better capacity to carry all of this water that is flowing into it. Now, because the river is so much wider and deeper, the river flows according to a laminar flow pattern. Do you remember that? Laminar flow is when the river water flows in smooth layers. Look at that river. It looks very calm as it flows along. Now, as this mature river is flowing on a flatter gradient, it does start to lose a little bit of energy. And as a result of this, as it's meandering and looping, it also starts to deposit sand. Now, I want you to consider this word. Remember, deposition is the laying down of material. So looking at that diagram, you will see that I've pointed out with the red arrow to floodplains. Now, floodplains start to develop in the mature stage of the fluvial cycle because the river starts to lay down the sand that it is carrying. Now, if you look, floodplains are the flat, sandy areas that develop on the sides of the river. Those floodplains are made up of material that the river has deposited. This sand we refer to as silt or alluvium. So that's a big thing to remember about the river in its mature stage. It starts to develop small floodplains as this river starts to deposit the material that it's carrying. Here we are looking at the cross profile of the mature stage of the river valley. This shows us that not only is this river valley very much wider, but it is U-shaped. And here again, I'm trying to show you how this valley creates this U-shape, somewhat different to the V shape of your young river valley. Logically, we're now moving down the length of the river, and we're now going to move on to have a look at the characteristics of a river in its final stage, its old stage, its lower stage as it approaches its mouth. Wow, look at that. So as the river flows towards its mouth, so it flows on a completely flat gradient. As a result of that, this old river flows very slowly. Now this really makes sense to me. When I think about a young river, we know that it flows with lots of energy and turbulence and it's bubbling. Think of a little 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a little 4-year-old. They never stop running. They have this never-ending reserve of energy. And then, as the river becomes mature, and obviously it's flowing on a flatter gradient, it flows with less energy. It's a little bit more reserved. That would be like you guys. Cool teenagers, slightly older people, a little bit more reserved, a little less energy. And then, of course, the river becomes old, and like any old being, it has less energy and it flows along a lot slower. Now, because this river is flowing slow, it's old, it's got no energy. Therefore, it cannot carry its heavy load. This old river is full of suspension. It's full of sand, it's full of mud, and it doesn't have the energy to carry this load any longer. And therefore, in the old stage of the river, there is large-scale deposition. Very little erosion takes place, hardly any. The river just lacks so much energy that as the velocity of the river decreases and as this river flows slowly, so it deposits more and more silt and alluvium. Not only does the river deposit the silt on the sides of the river, but it also just drops the silt onto its own riverbed. This means that an old river is very shallow. It's so full of sand and silt that it can't hold as much water. It becomes shallow. And this is why an old river frequently goes into flood when there is a lot of rain. Look at that. An old river meanders widely across a flat floodplain. Those meanders are much more exaggerated than what they were in the middle stage of the fluvial cycle. There is so much deposition going on that those floodplains are large. That is one of the biggest characteristics about the river in its old stage. There are large floodplains. These floodplains, of course, keep in mind, are extremely fertile. Okay, silt is full of minerals. And that is why people often like to settle and live on the floodplain of a river. They like to cultivate and grow crops because it's just so fertile and moist. But of course, not a good idea because these old rivers flood often. An old river is overloaded with suspension. It has a very, very heavy suspension load, and as a result, it's extremely muddy. It has a laminar flow pattern. One of the biggest characteristics of a river in its old stage of its fluvial cycle is its wide, open, U-shaped valley. Flat, that's the word that should slap you in the face when you have a look at an old river valley. It is extremely wide, flat, and we refer to it as an open U-shaped valley. And there we see the cross profile of an old river valley. It is wide, it is open, and we say it is an open U-shape valley. So guys, I hope that makes the fluvial cycle clear to you. The youthful stage, near the source, in the mountains, steep gradient. The middle stage, mature, left the mountains, slightly flatter gradient, wide U-shaped valleys. And finally, the old or the lower stage, close to the mouth, flat, lots of deposition and floodplains with a flat, open U-shaped valley. Please, everybody, look over your notes. This does deal with heading 7 in your notes, the fluvial cycle. So that brings us to the end of lesson 4. Have a wonderful day.